Hello, my name's Chris, and I've been a teacher of business studies and economics for about 27 years now. Today we're going to look at wage determination. So our lesson objectives today are to understand how wages are determined by the intersection of the demand and supply curves for labour, understand what is meant by economic rent, and understand what is meant by transfer earnings. We'll also look at the impact of trade unions on wages and employment levels. So a recap of how the demand curve for labour is formed. This is the marginal revenue product for labour, and that equals the demand curve. Basically, employers will employ labour up to the point where it makes them a profit. Now we're assuming here that capital is fixed, so we can employ more labour, but as we employ more labour, they get less productive because we're not employing any more capital. And you can see here how we've got the demand curve for one firm. The whole market is made up of the aggregate of all the single firms in the market added together. Now, supply curve, quite simple. The higher the hourly wage, the more hours people will supply of their labour. Now, wages are determined by the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve for labour. So if I just get my pen and I'll draw a line across, there we go, and a line down. It's just like supply and demand theory, but in this case we've got L for labour, hours supplied, and we've also got, let me just copy that. Oh, apologies for that. And the text here, W for wages. There we go. So we can see the wage rate is at the equilibrium point where supply of labour is equal to the demand for labour, which gives us our wage rate for the market and how much is supplied at that wage rate. Just clear my, let's go back. Apologies for that. So I'm just going to clear my drawings on there, and we'll move on to our next diagram. So there we go, we've got it in display there. Now, if the demand curve shifts, so in this case, our demand for labour has shifted to the right, we can see it causes a wage rate increase from W to W2, and the quantity supplied increases from Q1 to Q2. So that's a shift in the demand. Now that could be caused by something like, it could be a seasonal shift. So for instance, we're coming up to Christmas maybe, you may need some extra seasonal workers, and you'll have a shift in the demand for seasonal workers, which may cause a slight increase in wages for a short period of time. Now, transfer earnings. This is the minimum payment needed to keep a factor of production in its present use. Now, transfer earnings is basically we could attract people out of one industry into another industry by offering them more money. Economic rent is a payment received by a factor of production over and above that which they need to keep in the present occupation. So we'll have a look at that as a diagram, and we can see here that these people down here, and I'll just get a pen there. Let's grab a pen. So we can draw here. There we go. So on this line here, down this area here, these people are quite willing to work for a lower wage than the market rate. So these people, if you say you are willing to work at this lower wage, so I'll just get my line tool. If you're willing to work down at that wage, okay, and there will be some people willing to work at that lower wage. We'll just call it W. They're actually going to get paid W1 because that's the market rate. So they will be getting the difference there as extra economic rent. It's a bit like producer surplus and consumer surplus, where producers can produce at a lower rate but actually gain the market rate, and likewise for consumers, where they would quite willingly pay a higher rate for their workers but actually only have to pay a lower rate at the market rate. So you can see that's economic rent and that's transfer earnings. So if I just go back and remind you of what those two meant. I'll just clear my drawings. The minimum payment needed to keep a factor of production in its present use is the transfer earnings, and economic rent is money received over and above that which is needed to keep it in its present occupation. So this is a transfer earnings, and that's the economic rent. Now, in a lot of industries, trade unions operate. There's only very few examples of highly competitive labour markets. Trade unions use collective bargaining for the benefit of their members. In other words, they group everyone together and use the power of all those voices and are channeled through trade unions. So trade unions go and act on behalf of all the workers rather than each individual worker negotiating their own wage. The trade unions will negotiate on behalf of a whole collection of workers. Where trade unions act as a monopoly supplier of labour, no workers will work for below the wage agreed upon. This can lead to alter the supply curve and reduce the number of workers employed. So where you have everyone in a trade union working for a business, you may get this situation happening where we've got a wage above the equilibrium price, and you can see everyone starts at W2. So the traditional curve doesn't really exist below that point because everyone is getting paid at W2. Now at W2, more hours are offered, and if I just draw a line in there, more hours are offered than are actually demanded. So you can see there is a massive difference between, should have drawn the arrow the other way around, I'll just rub that out and do that again. There we go. So there's a big difference between how many hours are offered and how many are demanded. The firm will only demand when the supply curve crosses the marginal revenue product. And because the unions have, using collective bargaining, forced the wage above the equilibrium, then the supply curve becomes this slightly abnormal shaped curve, and it cuts the demand curve further up, which means businesses demand far less labour because of the higher wages. So in effect, the effect of trade unions is to reduce the amount of labour that businesses demand, which really isn't very good for labour. So it's counterintuitive a little bit. So the effect of trade unions is actually to reduce the amount of labour demanded in a perfectly competitive market. And what producers will do in this instance is they will switch to a more capital intensive production method to reduce the amount of labour that's required. So moving on, does this happen in every situation? So we've seen our diagram where the wage is forced up by the trade union and the firm has to employ less people, because following the theory, they will employ where marginal revenue product is crossed by the supply curve. And the trade union effect has distorted our supply curve, so everyone is earning W2. We're not in a perfectly competitive market, and therefore we will have less people being employed. So we'll have that reduction from Q1 to Q2. At that wage, obviously they would prefer to supply more labour, but the firm won't take it. Now, that would show a reduction in employment. If unions can help increase productivity in their membership, they can achieve a rightward shift of the MRP curve. So if we go back to our diagram on our previous slide, if we can effectively shift our MRP curve and get that crossing at that point, then we can have our increase of wages and also an increase of employment. I'll just do another quick line. There we go. So the suppliers would be happy, the business employing the workers would be happy because they could employ more people because those people are far more productive. So it's not always that a trade union will reduce the amount of people employed. It depends if they can shift that MRP curve through increased productivity. Now, another thing that we can do is look at what kind of market there is. Employers with labour market power. So firms that employ a high percentage of workers in a market can influence the wage rate. So for example, a large steelworks operating in a town. There they act as a monopolist employer, where there is only one employer in the market. So for example, I said steel manufacturing, it could be a government agency in the area, it could be soldiers, it could be, let's say we're trained as a nurse, NHS are the main employer of nurses. To employ more workers, they would have to raise the wage rate for all. So in a perfectly competitive labour market, you've got different firms offering different wage rates. But in a monopolist situation, you've only got one firm, so they would have to offer the same wage for all its workers. This means the marginal cost of labour will exceed the average cost of labour. In other words, for every single extra person or hour employed, they would have to offer everyone else the same wage rate. So although other people in a perfectly competitive market, not everybody is being paid exactly the same, in a monopsonous situation, everybody gets the same amount. So if wage rates rise for one person, they rise for everybody. So you get a steeper marginal cost for labour curve. And you can see that on this diagram. So the marginal cost for labour is the steeper curve, and that's the average cost for labour, which is the supply curve. Now, a monopsonist will employ people where the marginal cost for labour crosses the marginal revenue product. It's the cost of employing those extra people. So they will employ down here, because effectively we've got a kinked curve where people they will employ at this point, but they have to come down to the average cost for labour curve, and where that crosses is the wage rate they will pay. So they won't pay up here where the marginal cost for labour crosses the line. They will pay further down where the average cost for labour is hit as they come down from where the marginal cost for labour crosses the demand curve, or the marginal revenue product curve. So monopsonists will prefer to restrict employment, depressing wages below the free market value. So let's have a look what will happen if we add trade unions into the mix here. If we add trade unions into the mix, we can see we shift up the wages, because they'll use collective bargaining to shift up the wages, and that wage rate becomes the new normal wage rate. And they go across, and that hits the average cost for labour or supply curve at point A, which will go up and make a new marginal cost for labour curve that hits the marginal revenue product curve, or the demand curve, at a different point. So they'll actually employ more people than they did before, because trade unions had been involved, because they will employ where the marginal cost for labour cuts the marginal revenue product curve. Just leave that on there for a minute for you to take that diagram in. So we've looked at how wages are determined by the intersection of demand and supply curve. Remember, that's only in a perfectly competitive market. We understand what is meant by the economic rent, and understand what is meant by transfer earnings. And we can see the impact of trade unions on wages, both in a perfectly competitive market. Remember, they can increase wages effectively if they can increase the productivity of their labour, if they don't, then potentially increasing wages will reduce the amount of labour employed. In a monopsony, trade unions can have a positive effect on the amount of labour employed at higher wages. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.